The evening air had a crisp bite to it as Anthony Reynolds locked his office door. The clock on his phone showed 9:47 p.m., another late night wrapping up case notes. At 43, he had grown accustomed to these hours, though his wife often teased him about being married to his work. Tonight's dinner meeting with a key witness had run longer than expected, but it had been productive. Anthony loosened his tie slightly as he walked to his car in the nearly empty parking garage. The city lights sparkled in the distance, creating a peaceful backdrop to an otherwise exhausting day. He slid into his sedan, a practical four-door he'd chosen for its reliability rather than flash, and headed toward home. The drive was peaceful at this hour. Traffic had thinned, and Anthony found himself enjoying the rare moment of quiet. He turned onto Oakwood Avenue, a well-lit street that would take him to the highway. His thoughts drifted to the weekend ahead, his daughter's basketball game, the yard work he'd been putting off, maybe even that fishing trip his brother-in-law had been suggesting for months. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror, pulling him from his thoughts. Anthony checked his speedometer. He was going exactly the speed limit. He signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, his mind running through a mental checklist. License and registration in the glove compartment. No taillight issues that he knew of. He hadn't been on his phone. 2 officers approached his car, one on each side. The taller one, a white officer with a crew cut, shined his flashlight directly into Anthony's eyes, making him squint. "License and registration," the officer demanded. His tone clipped. "Good evening, officer," Anthony replied calmly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer's face hardened. "License and registration first," Anthony nodded. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my wallet is in my inner jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" The officer gave a curt nod, his hand resting near his holster. Anthony moved slowly, deliberately, retrieving the documents with careful movements he had practiced mentally countless times. A sad reality for a black professional man in America. As he handed over his license and registration, the second officer, younger with dark hair and a name tag reading Officer Reyes, circled the car, shining his flashlight into the back seat. "You swerved back there." The first officer, Officer Wilson, according to his badge, stated flatly. Anthony furrowed his brow. "I don't believe I did, sir. I've been driving carefully." Officer Wilson ignored the response, examining Anthony's license with exaggerated scrutiny. "Where are you coming from at this hour, Mr. Reynolds?" "I was working late. I'm an attorney, and I had a dinner meeting with a client." The officer's eyebrow raised slightly. "An attorney, huh? And what kind of law do you practice?" Before Anthony could answer, Officer Reyes called from the passenger side. "I think I see something on the floor in the back." Anthony turned, confused. "There's nothing in my car except some case files and my gym bag." "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Officer Wilson commanded, his hand now fully resting on his holster. Anthony felt his heartbeat quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "May I ask why? I haven't done anything wrong." "Step out of the vehicle now," Wilson repeated, his voice harder. "We have reason to believe there may be contraband in your vehicle." Knowing his rights but also aware of the danger in appearing non-compliant, Anthony carefully opened his door and stepped out. The night air felt suddenly colder. "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," he stated clearly. "I've done nothing wrong and you have no probable cause." Officer Wilson's face tightened. "We observed erratic driving and possible signs of impairment. That gives us reason to search." "I've been driving perfectly fine and I'm completely sober," Anthony replied, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "I'd like to know the specific behavior that gave you reason to pull me over." Instead of answering, Officer Wilson directed him to stand by the patrol car, while Officer Reyes began searching his vehicle without waiting for consent. "This is an illegal search," Anthony said, his legal training kicking in despite the adrenaline now pumping through his system. "You don't have probable cause or my consent." "You arguing with me?" Officer Wilson stepped closer, invading Anthony's personal space. "Because that sounds like interference with an officer performing his duties." Anthony took a deep breath. "I'm not arguing, officer. I'm simply stating that I know my rights and this search violates the Fourth Amendment." Something shifted in Officer Wilson's expression, a flash of annoyance mixed with something else. He grabbed Anthony's arm, suddenly spinning him around, hands against the car. Now. What? Why? Anthony asked, genuinely shocked by the escalation. You're being detained for questioning. Hands on the car. Anthony complied, placing his palms flat against the cool metal of the patrol car. The position was humiliating, visible to any passing cars, but he remained calm. There's nothing in here, Officer Reyes called from inside Anthony's car, where he had been rifling through the console and glove compartment. Officer Wilson proceeded to pat Anthony down with unnecessary roughness. Finding nothing, his frustration seemed to grow. Have you been drinking tonight, Mr. Attorney? He asked, his tone mocking. No, I have not, Anthony replied evenly. I don't drink alcohol at all. Mind taking a breathalyzer then? I don't mind, though I still don't understand why I was pulled over. The breathalyzer test, as Anthony expected, showed 0 alcohol in his system. Rather than apologize or explain, Officer Wilson seemed even more determined to find something wrong. Meanwhile, Officer Reyes had pulled Anthony's briefcase from the back seat and was attempting to open it. That contains confidential client information, Anthony protested. It's protected by attorney-client privilege. Officer Wilson's expression darkened. You need to lower your voice and stop telling us how to do our job. I'm simply informing you of the law, Anthony replied, his patience wearing thin despite his best efforts. That briefcase contains privileged information that you are not legally permitted to view without a warrant. That's it, Officer Wilson snapped. Turn around. Before Anthony could process what was happening, the officer had grabbed his wrists and was placing handcuffs on him. What are you doing? Anthony asked, stunned. On what grounds am I being arrested? Disorderly conduct and resisting an officer, Wilson stated, tightening the cuffs until they bit into Anthony's wrists. You have the right to remain silent. As the officer recited the Miranda rights, Anthony stood in disbelief. After 15 years practicing law, after building a respected career and always going out of his way to be polite to law enforcement, he was being arrested on trumped-up charges simply for knowing and stating his rights. Officer Reyes, looking somewhat uncomfortable, closed Anthony's briefcase and returned it to the car. My car, Anthony began. It'll be towed. Officer Wilson cut him off. You can retrieve your belongings after posting bail. The ride to the police station was silent and tense. Anthony's mind raced, calculating his next moves. He would need to call his wife, then a colleague who handled criminal defense. He knew the system well enough to understand that his professional credentials wouldn't protect him from spending at least one night in a holding cell. At the station, the booking process was deliberately slow. The desk sergeant barely looked at him as his fingerprints were taken, his personal belongings cataloged and placed in a plastic bin. He was permitted one phone call, which he used to contact his wife, keeping his voice steady as he explained the situation and asked her to call their friend Thomas, who practiced criminal defense. I love you, he told her before hanging up. Don't worry. This is all a mistake that will get sorted out. But as he was led to a holding cell, Anthony knew that mistake wasn't the right word. What had happened wasn't an error or a misunderstanding. It was something more systemic, more intentional. He had been pulled over for no valid reason, searched without cause, and arrested for asserting his constitutional rights. As the cell door closed behind him, Anthony sat on the hard bench and closed his eyes briefly. He knew what would come next, a night in this cell, an arraignment in the morning, likely before Judge Simmons, who had a reputation for siding with police officers in cases like these. What the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known when they decided to pull over a black man in an ordinary sedan on a quiet night, was exactly who Anthony Reynolds was in the legal community. They had no idea that their actions would soon be scrutinized at the highest levels of the justice system, or that the man they had handcuffed and humiliated would soon turn their world upside down in a courtroom. For now, though, Anthony simply waited, his lawyer's mind already preparing for the battle ahead, reviewing every detail of the encounter, every procedural violation, every word exchanged. By morning, he would be ready. The night stretched long before him, but Anthony Reynolds had faced longer nights, harder challenges. This was no longer just about him. What happened in that courtroom would matter, not just for his case, but for countless others who didn't have his knowledge, his resources, or his position. That thought kept him upright on the uncomfortable bench as the hours slowly passed. Morning arrived with the harsh fluorescent lights of the holding cell flickering on without warning. Anthony opened his eyes, his back stiff from the hard bench. He had managed perhaps 2 hours of restless sleep. A guard appeared, rattling the cell door. "Reynolds, your lawyer's here." Anthony stood, straightening his wrinkled suit as best he could. He followed the guard down a narrow hallway to a small consultation room where Thomas Chen waited, briefcase open on the metal table. "Anthony," Thomas said, rising to embrace his friend. "Lisa called me last night. I've been here since 6 trying to get you processed quickly." "Thanks for coming," Anthony replied, his voice slightly hoarse from the dry air and lack of sleep. Thomas looked him over. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Anthony admitted, taking a seat across from his friend. "But I'm more angry than anything else." Thomas nodded, pulling out a legal pad. "Walk me through exactly what happened." For the next 20 minutes, Anthony recounted every detail of the previous night: the initial stop, the officer's behavior, the illegal search, and the escalation that led to his arrest. Thomas took meticulous notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "This is textbook racial profiling and police misconduct," Thomas said when Anthony finished. "The charges are completely fabricated. Disorderly conduct? Resisting arrest? You were simply asserting your rights." "Who's the judge for arraignment today?" Anthony asked, though he already suspected the answer. Thomas's expression confirmed his fears. "Judge Harold Simmons." Anthony leaned back, a small bitter smile crossing his face. "Of course." Judge Simmons had a well-known reputation in legal circles. A former prosecutor with close ties to the police department, he rarely ruled against officers in cases involving their testimony. His courtroom was known as a place where police accounts went unchallenged and where defendants, particularly black and brown defendants, faced an uphill battle. "I've pulled some strings to get you first on the docket," Thomas said. "Arraignment is in 30 minutes. The charges are misdemeanors, so we'll enter a not guilty plea and request immediate dismissal based on lack of probable cause and police misconduct. And when Simmons denies that request, then we request a formal hearing and push for discovery of the dashcam footage and officer records." Thomas closed his notepad. "One step at a time, Anthony. Let's get you out of here first." An hour later, Anthony stood in courtroom 3B, the fluorescent lights even harsher than those in the holding cell. The room was standard issue. American flag behind the bench, wooden gallery seating, the low barrier separating the gallery from the proceedings area. Despite the early hour, several people sat in the gallery, mostly family members of other defendants waiting their turn. Judge Harold Simmons entered, a thin man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and a perpetual frown. Everyone rose as the bailiff called the court to order. "Be seated," Simmons said, his voice clipped and impatient. He shuffled through the papers before him, then looked up. "First case, State versus Reynolds. Charges of disorderly conduct and resisting a peace officer." Thomas and Anthony approached the defense table. Across the aisle, a young assistant district attorney stood at the prosecution table, looking slightly harried as she organized her files. Behind her, officers Wilson and Reyes sat in the first row of the gallery, Wilson looking smug, Reyes somewhat uncomfortable. "Your Honor," the ADA began, "the state charges the defendant with Class A misdemeanors under Sections 26-1 and 31-1 of the Criminal Code. The arresting officers report that the defendant became belligerent during a routine traffic stop, refused to comply with lawful orders, and verbally abused the officers when they attempted to conduct a search based on reasonable suspicion." Anthony kept his face expressionless, though internally he marveled at how completely the officers had fabricated their account. Judge Simmons peered at Anthony over his reading glasses. "How does the defendant plead?" Thomas stepped forward. "Not guilty, Your Honor, and we request immediate dismissal of all charges." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "On what grounds, Counselor?" "Lack of probable cause, Your Honor. My client was pulled over without any traffic violation, searched without consent or reasonable suspicion, and arrested for simply asserting his constitutional rights. This is a clear case of police misconduct and racial profiling." The ADA immediately objected. "Your Honor, the officers had reasonable suspicion based on erratic driving patterns and the defendant's nervous behavior during the stop." "I was not driving erratically," Anthony said quietly to Thomas. Judge Simmons fixed Anthony with a cold stare. "The defendant will refrain from speaking unless directly addressed by the court." Thomas placed a calming hand on Anthony's arm. Your Honor, my client maintains that he was driving in full compliance with all traffic laws and that the officer's claim of erratic driving is completely unfounded. We request immediate access to the dashcam footage, which will confirm our position. Judge Simmons waved his hand dismissively. That's a matter for discovery if this proceeds to trial. For now, we're simply conducting an arraignment. Your Honor, Thomas persisted. Given the lack of probable cause and the serious nature of the officer's misconduct, we request that all charges be dismissed immediately. The judge's expression hardened. Motion denied. This court finds sufficient basis to proceed based on the officer's sworn statements. Thomas tried again. Then we request a formal evidentiary hearing before proceeding further. Your Honor, the officer's account is contradicted by my client's statement and will be disproven by the dashcam footage. Counselor, Judge Simmons said, his tone growing irritated. Your client was arrested by two experienced officers who have sworn under oath that he was uncooperative and disorderly. Unless you have evidence to the contrary, this court accepts their account. Anthony watched as the judge consistently favored the prosecution's arguments. When the ADA spoke, Simmons leaned forward attentively. When Thomas raised objections, the judge dismissed them with barely a consideration. It was exactly as he had expected, yet still infuriating to witness. Your Honor, the ADA said, given the defendant's apparent lack of respect for law enforcement, the state requests reasonable bail be set. Thomas immediately countered. My client has no criminal record, strong community ties as a homeowner and father, and poses absolutely no flight risk. We request release on his own recognizance. Judge Simmons seemed to consider this briefly. Bail is set at $1,000. Next appearance is scheduled for preliminary hearing 2 weeks from today. He banged his gavel. Next case. As they gathered their papers, Thomas muttered, That went exactly as expected. Anthony nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't even pretend to consider our arguments. After posting bail, Anthony finally emerged from the courthouse into the late morning sunlight. His wife Lisa was waiting, her face lined with worry. She rushed forward to embrace him. Are you okay? She asked, pulling back to examine his face. I'm fine, he assured her, though fine was far from how he felt. Just tired and angry. Thomas joined them, handing Anthony a folder. I've already filed motions for discovery. We need that dashcam footage before the preliminary hearing. Anthony nodded, his mind already working through strategies. We also need Officer Wilson's record. I'd bet good money this isn't his first questionable arrest. I'll handle it, Thomas promised. Go home, get some rest. We'll regroup tomorrow. As they walked to Lisa's car, Anthony filled her in on the details of the arraignment. Simmons, she said, shaking her head. Why am I not surprised? You should have seen how he looked at me, Anthony replied. Like I was guilty the moment I walked in. Never mind that I've argued dozens of cases in his courtroom over the years. But he didn't recognize you? Lisa asked. Anthony gave a hollow laugh. I doubt he even really looked at me. To him, I was just another black defendant, presumed guilty from the start. At home, after a shower and change of clothes, Anthony sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. Instead of opening the brief he'd been working on before his arrest, he pulled up the Judicial Oversight Committee website. What are you thinking? Lisa asked, setting a sandwich beside him. Anthony looked up at his wife, determination replacing the fatigue in his eyes. I'm thinking it's time Judge Simmons faced some scrutiny of his own. I'm going to request his complete record of rulings in cases involving police testimony versus civilian testimony, broken down by race. Lisa sat on the edge of the desk. You're not just fighting these charges, are you? You're going after the whole system. I have to, Anthony said simply. What happened to me last night? What happened in that courtroom this morning? It happens to people every day who don't have my resources or knowledge of the law. If I don't use this opportunity to shine a light on it, what was the point of all these years working in the justice system? Lisa squeezed his hand. I'm with you. But pace yourself. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. Anthony nodded, turning back to his computer. As he began to type, a plan was forming in his mind. Judge Simmons and Officers Wilson and Reyes had no idea what was coming. They thought they were dealing with just another defendant, someone who would be intimidated by the system and accept a plea deal to avoid the hassle. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Over the next 2 weeks, Anthony and Thomas built their case methodically. They filed motion after motion, requesting everything from the officers' personnel files to Judge Simmons' pattern of rulings. Many were denied, but some were granted by other judges who reviewed the motions. Most importantly, they secured the dashcam footage, which clearly showed Anthony driving perfectly normally before being pulled over. It also captured audio of the entire encounter, including Anthony's calm, respectful responses and the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. As the date for the preliminary hearing approached, Anthony reviewed their strategy with Thomas one final time. "We let them dig their own grave," Thomas confirmed. "Let the officers testify first, get their lies on the record." Anthony nodded. "And then we spring the trap." The night before the hearing, Anthony could barely sleep. Not from anxiety, but from anticipation. For years, he had worked within the system, believing he could change it gradually from the inside. Now he had a chance to force a reckoning in the most direct way possible. Tomorrow would be a day Judge Simmons would never forget. The morning of the preliminary hearing dawned bright and clear. Anthony adjusted his tie in the mirror, meeting his own eyes with steady determination. Today would be different from the arraignment. Today the truth would come out. "You ready for this?" Lisa asked, watching him from the doorway of their bedroom. "More than ready," Anthony replied, slipping on his suit jacket. Charcoal gray, impeccably tailored. He had chosen it deliberately. Professional, authoritative, unmistakably the attire of someone who belonged in a courtroom. Downstairs, he kissed his daughter goodbye. At 12, Zoe was old enough to know something serious was happening, but young enough that they had sheltered her from the worst details. "Good luck, Dad," she said, hugging him tightly. "Show them who's boss." Anthony smiled at her confidence. "I'll do my best, honey." Thomas was waiting outside the courthouse steps, looking unusually formal in a navy suit. "I've got some news," he said as Anthony approached. "Judge Simmons' clerk just informed me that they've moved us to courtroom 2A, the larger one." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Why the change?" "Apparently there's been some media interest in the case." Thomas gave him a knowing look. Word must have gotten out. Inside, courtroom 2A was indeed larger than the one where the arraignment had taken place, with room for at least 100 people in the gallery. Already about 20 seats were filled, mostly with faces Anthony recognized from the local legal community. Word had indeed spread, though not yet to the wider media. The ADA from the arraignment was at the prosecution table, now joined by her supervisor, District Attorney Peter Walsh. Their presence confirmed what Anthony had suspected. Someone in the DA's office had finally realized who he was and was scrambling to contain the situation. Officers Wilson and Reyes sat in the front row behind the prosecution, Wilson looking confident as ever, Reyes noticeably less so. The younger officer kept fidgeting with his tie, eyes darting around the room. "Good morning, gentlemen," Thomas said as he and Anthony passed. Officer Wilson just stared, but Reyes gave a small, uncomfortable nod. As they settled at the defense table, the bailiff called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Harold Simmons presiding. Judge Simmons entered, his face set in its usual stern expression. If he noticed the unusually full gallery or the presence of the district attorney, he gave no indication. "Be seated," he said, arranging his papers. "We're here for the preliminary hearing in the State v. Reynolds, case number 24 CM 1593. Are both sides ready to proceed?" "The State is ready, Your Honor," D.A. Walsh said, standing. "Defense is ready, Your Honor," Thomas replied. Judge Simmons nodded. "Very well, Mr. Walsh, you may call your first witness." The district attorney stood. "The State calls Officer James Wilson." Officer Wilson took the stand, was sworn in, and sat with the same confident posture he'd displayed throughout the arrest. Under Walsh's questioning, he recounted a version of events that bore little resemblance to reality, claiming Anthony had been swerving, appeared intoxicated, became belligerent, and repeatedly interfered with their duties. "And at what point did you decide to place Mr. Reynolds under arrest?" Walsh asked. "When he began shouting and refusing to comply with our instructions," Wilson replied smoothly. "He was creating a public disturbance and actively impeding our investigation." Anthony wrote notes as Wilson testified, documenting each lie for Thomas to address in cross-examination. Judge Simmons watched the proceedings with the same bias he'd shown at the arraignment, nodding along with Wilson's testimony, frowning when Anthony or Thomas reacted to particularly egregious falsehoods. When Walsh finished his direct examination, Thomas stood for cross. Officer Wilson, he began. You testified that my client was driving erratically, swerving between lanes. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. Thomas approached the witness stand. And this alleged erratic driving was the basis for the initial traffic stop? Yes, it was. Your patrol car is equipped with a dash cam, correct? Wilson shifted slightly. Yes. And that dash cam was functioning properly on the night in question? As far as I know, yes. Thomas nodded. Your Honor, the defense would like to enter into evidence Exhibit A, the dash cam footage from Officer Wilson's patrol vehicle, which we obtained through discovery. Judge Simmons frowned. Proceed. A court officer set up a monitor facing the judge, jury box, and witness stand with another screen for the gallery to view. Thomas played the footage, which clearly showed Anthony's car driving perfectly normally, maintaining its lane, and traveling exactly at the speed limit before the police lights appeared. Officer Wilson, Thomas said when the clip ended, would you care to explain the discrepancy between your testimony and what we just saw? Wilson's face hardened. The camera doesn't show everything. From my perspective, the vehicle was moving erratically. Thomas played another clip, this one with audio capturing the entire interaction between Anthony and the officers. The contrast between Anthony's calm, respectful responses and Wilson's increasingly aggressive tone was stark. Officer Wilson, at what point in that recording did my client shout at you or become belligerent? Thomas asked. He was being uncooperative and disrespectful, Wilson insisted. That wasn't my question. I asked when he shouted at you as you testified earlier. Wilson's jaw tightened. His tone was disrespectful. So he didn't actually shout? Not in those exact words, no. Thomas continued methodically dismantling Wilson's testimony, pointing out contradiction after contradiction between his account and the objective evidence. Throughout the cross-examination, Judge Simmons repeatedly sustained objections from the prosecution on questionable grounds, while overruling valid objections from the defense. When Thomas finished with Wilson, the district attorney called Officer Reyes to the stand. The younger officer's testimony largely matched Wilson's, though he seemed increasingly uncomfortable as he spoke. During cross-examination, Thomas was equally thorough with Reyes, who eventually admitted that Anthony had not been shouting or physically resistant during the arrest. One final question, Officer Reyes, Thomas said. In your years on the force, have you ever reported another officer for misconduct? Objection, Walsh called out. Relevance. Sustained, Judge Simmons said immediately. The jury will disregard the question. Thomas nodded, returning to his seat. No further questions, Your Honor. The district attorney rose. The state rests, Your Honor. Very well, Judge Simmons said. Defense may present its case. Thomas stood. Defense calls Anthony Reynolds. Anthony walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and seated himself. He could feel all eyes in the courtroom on him. The officers, the prosecutors, the judge, the spectators in the gallery. Mr. Reynolds, Thomas began. Please tell the court what you do for a living. Anthony leaned slightly toward the microphone. I am an attorney. And where do you practice law? Anthony straightened his shoulders. I am an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Simmons' head snapped up from his notes, his eyes widening slightly as he truly looked at Anthony for the first time. For how long have you held this position? Thomas continued, his voice calm despite the growing reaction in the courtroom. 11 years, Anthony replied. Before that, I spent 4 years with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division in Washington. The district attorney was hurriedly whispering to his assistant. Officer Wilson's confident expression had faltered, replaced by something closer to alarm. Officer Reyes was staring at the floor. And in your capacity as a federal prosecutor, what types of cases do you typically handle? Thomas asked. I specialize in public corruption cases, particularly those involving law enforcement misconduct and civil rights violations. Anthony answered clearly. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Judge Simmons' face had lost some of its color, and he was now watching Anthony with an entirely different expression, one of recognition and growing concern. Mr. Reynolds, please tell the court in your own words what happened on the night of your arrest, Thomas said. For the next 15 minutes, Anthony recounted the events exactly as they had occurred. His voice steady and professional, he described the unwarranted traffic stop, the illegal search, the fabricated charges. all without raising his voice or showing the anger he still felt. "Did you at any point shout at the officers or resist their instructions?" Thomas asked. "No, I did not," Anthony replied. "I remained calm and respectful throughout the encounter, even as it became clear that my rights were being violated. No further questions." "Your Honor," Thomas said, returning to his seat. Judge Simmons cleared his throat. "Mr. Walsh, your cross-examination." The district attorney stood slowly. "The state has no questions for this witness, Your Honor." A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Judge Simmons looked momentarily confused. "Very well," he said. "Does the defense rest?" "Not quite, Your Honor," Thomas replied. "Defense calls Dr. Lawrence Henderson." A distinguished older man made his way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, he identified himself as the chair of the Criminal Justice Department at the State University and an expert in patterns of racial bias in policing and judicial proceedings. "Dr. Henderson," Thomas began, "have you had an opportunity to review Judge Simmons' ruling history in cases involving police testimony versus civilian testimony?" "Objection." Walsh was on his feet. "This line of questioning is completely inappropriate and irrelevant to the current proceedings." "Your Honor," Thomas countered, "we intend to demonstrate a pattern of judicial bias that directly impacts this case and constitutes a violation of my client's constitutional rights." For the first time, Judge Simmons looked genuinely unsettled. "Approach the bench, both of you." As Thomas and Walsh conferred with the judge in hushed tones, Anthony watched the gallery, where more spectators had arrived, including what appeared to be a reporter from the local newspaper. After several minutes, the attorneys returned to their tables, and Judge Simmons addressed the court. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," he announced, his voice not quite as steady as before. "Counsel for both sides, please remain." As the spectators filed out for the break, Anthony caught Officer Wilson's eye. The man who had arrested him with such arrogant certainty now looked away quickly, unable to hold his gaze. In the hallway outside, Lisa was waiting. "I saw everything," she said. "The look on Simmons's face when you said you were a U.S. attorney was priceless." Anthony allowed himself a small smile. "This isn't over yet, but the truth is finally coming out." "What do you think will happen now?" she asked. Anthony glanced back at the courtroom doors. "I think they're about to offer us a deal, but I'm not interested in deals. This was never just about me." As they waited for the court to reconvene, Anthony felt a strange mix of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also sadness that it had taken his position as a federal prosecutor to make anyone take his experience seriously. How many others had stood where he stood, faced the same injustice, but lacked the credentials that suddenly made Judge Simmons and the district attorney pay attention? The bailiff appeared at the door. "Mr. Reynolds, they're ready for you." Anthony squeezed Lisa's hand and walked back into the courtroom, ready for whatever came next. When Anthony re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The gallery was now completely full, with several people standing along the back wall. He recognized faces from the local legal community, court staff who had no reason to be there except curiosity, and at least 3 reporters scribbling in notepads. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Walsh sat with a grim expression, flanked by 2 assistants who hadn't been there before the recess. Officers Wilson and Reyes had moved to separate seats, no longer sitting together. Judge Simmons emerged from his chambers, his earlier confidence replaced by a carefully neutral expression. As everyone stood, Anthony noticed the judge scanning the gallery, clearly registering the growing audience. "Be seated," Simmons said, his voice clipped. "Before we continue with the defense's witness, the state has requested an opportunity to address the court." Walsh rose slowly. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented and after careful review of the circumstances surrounding this case, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Reynolds without prejudice." A low murmur spread through the gallery. Without prejudice meant they could theoretically refile charges later, though everyone in the room knew that wouldn't happen. Judge Simmons nodded. "Does the defense have any objection to this motion?" Thomas stood. "Your Honor, while we appreciate the state's recognition that these charges are without merit, the defense objects to dismissal without prejudice. These charges were fabricated from the start, as the dashcam footage clearly demonstrates. We request dismissal with prejudice, and we intend to proceed with our evidence regarding patterns of bias in this court. Walsh's face tightened. Your Honor, the state has made a good faith offer to dismiss the charges. The defense's insistence on pursuing allegations against the court itself is unnecessary and inappropriate. Anthony leaned toward Thomas, whispering, "Let me speak." Thomas nodded and addressed the judge. Your Honor, my client wishes to address the court on this matter. Judge Simmons hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Very well. Anthony stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he moved to the center of the courtroom. He took a moment to look around, at the judge who had dismissed his rights, at the officers who had arrested him without cause, at the prosecutors who had pursued charges they should have known were baseless. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady and clear. I stand before this court not just as a defendant, but as an officer of the court and a representative of the federal justice system. What happened to me 2 weeks ago was not an isolated incident or a simple misunderstanding. It was a manifestation of systemic problems that plague our justice system. He gestured toward the dash cam footage still frozen on the monitor. The evidence clearly shows that I was pulled over without cause, searched without consent or probable cause, and arrested for simply knowing and asserting my constitutional rights. Had I been anyone else? Had I not been a federal prosecutor with the resources and knowledge to fight these charges, I would likely have been pressured into a plea deal for crimes I did not commit. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped writing, captivated by Anthony's words. I object to dismissal without prejudice because it allows everyone involved to walk away without accountability. It perpetuates the fiction that this was all a simple mistake rather than part of a pattern. He turned slightly to face the gallery. How many other citizens have stood where I'm standing, faced with fabricated charges and a system stacked against them? How many took plea deals because they couldn't afford to miss work for court appearances or pay for adequate legal representation? Judge Simmons shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Reynolds, the court appreciates your concerns, but with all due respect, Your Honor, Anthony continued firmly, I am not finished. The court has heard hours of false testimony from law enforcement without interruption. I believe I'm entitled to a few minutes to address the actual truth of this matter. A few gasps came from the gallery. No one spoke to Judge Simmons that way in his courtroom. But the judge, perhaps aware of the reporters present or simply recognizing the shift in power, nodded for Anthony to continue. Dr. Henderson was prepared to testify about the statistical patterns in Your Honor's rulings, specifically that you rule in favor of police testimony over civilian testimony approximately 97% of the time, and that this pattern is even more pronounced when the civilian is a person of color. Judge Simmons' face flushed. Those statistics can be interpreted in many ways, Mr. Reynolds. Yes, they can, Anthony agreed. Which is why we've also analyzed the reversal rate of your decisions on appeal, which is substantially higher than any other judge in this district, particularly in cases involving police testimony. These aren't opinions, Your Honor. These are documented facts. He turned to face Officers Wilson and Reyes. As for the officers involved, the defense has obtained records showing that Officer Wilson has been the subject of 17 civilian complaints regarding racial profiling and excessive force. None of these complaints resulted in disciplinary action, despite clear evidence in at least 5 cases. Officer Wilson stood abruptly. This is sit down, officer, Judge Simmons ordered sharply. Anthony continued calmly. In my capacity as an assistant U.S. attorney, I am formally notifying this court and the district attorney's office that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice will be opening an investigation into patterns and practices within both the police department and this court. The reaction was immediate. Walsh paling visibly, Judge Simmons gripping the edge of the bench, Officer Wilson sinking back into his seat with a stunned expression. Only Officer Reyes seemed unsurprised, staring at his hands with what looked like resignation. I am not seeking personal vengeance, Anthony said, his voice softening slightly. What I want, what every citizen deserves, is accountability and change. No one should experience what I experienced simply because of the color of their skin or their lack of legal knowledge. He turned back to Judge Simmons. So no, Your Honor, I do not accept dismissal without prejudice. I request dismissal with prejudice, a formal apology from the arresting officers and this court, and a commitment to meaningful reform in how this jurisdiction handles cases involving police testimony. For several seconds, the courtroom was completely silent. Then Judge Simmons cleared his throat. "The court will take a 15-minute recess to consider the defense's requests," he said, standing quickly and retreating to his chambers. As soon as the judge left, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Thomas clapped Anthony on the shoulder. "That," he said with a grin, "was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen in a courtroom." Anthony exhaled slowly, the tension of the moment finally releasing. "I've been wanting to say those things for years. Not just for myself, but for every defendant I've watched get railroaded through this system." Across the room, District Attorney Walsh was huddled with his assistants in urgent conversation. Officer Wilson had disappeared, but Officer Reyes remained in his seat. Looking lost in thought, to Anthony's surprise, Reyes stood and walked over to the defense table. "Mr. Reynolds," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for what happened. I should have spoken up that night, and I should have told the truth from the beginning." Anthony studied the younger officer's face. "Why didn't you?" Reyes glanced over his shoulder, then back to Anthony. "I've been on the force less than 2 years. Wilson's been my training officer since day one. He told me this is how things are done, that it's us versus them, and you either play along or you're out. And do you believe that?" Anthony asked. Reyes shook his head. "No. That's not why I became a cop." He hesitated, then added, "I have documentation, instances where Wilson has falsified reports, targeted specific neighborhoods and drivers. Would that help your investigation?" Thomas exchanged a look with Anthony. "It would help significantly," he said, sliding a business card toward Reyes. "Call my office tomorrow." Before Reyes could respond, the bailiff announced Judge Simmons' return. Everyone scrambled back to their places as the judge resumed the bench, looking as though he had aged years during the brief recess. "This court has considered the defense's requests," he began, his voice strained. "The charges against Anthony Reynolds are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The court, he paused, visibly struggling. "The court extends its apologies to Mr. Reynolds for any appearance of bias or impropriety in these proceedings." Anthony nodded slightly, acknowledging but not accepting the carefully worded non-apology. As for the broader concerns raised by the defense, Judge Simmons continued, "This court welcomes any review of its practices and will cooperate fully with any investigation the Department of Justice deems appropriate." He had no choice, of course. Such investigations didn't require judicial permission. But the statement was still remarkable, coming from a judge who had never before acknowledged even the possibility of bias in his courtroom. "This matter is concluded," Judge Simmons said, banging his gavel with less force than usual. "Court is adjourned." As people began filing out, reporters rushed toward Anthony, shouting questions. Thomas ran interference, promising a statement later while guiding Anthony through a side door. In a quiet corridor, they found Lisa waiting, a broad smile on her face. "I heard everything," she said, embracing her husband. "You were amazing." Anthony held her tightly, the reality of his victory finally sinking in. "It's just the beginning," he said quietly. "The real work starts now." Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office, local defense attorneys, and community activists who had heard about the case. As Anthony emerged, they broke into applause. Among them stood an older black man Anthony recognized as Richard Taylor, a community organizer who had been fighting against police misconduct for decades. He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for using your position to speak truth to power." Anthony shook his hand firmly. "I just did what anyone in my position should do." "But most don't," Taylor replied. "Most forget where they came from once they get that title and that office." Anthony nodded, understanding the weight of the older man's words. "This can't be just one case, just one moment. It has to be the beginning of real change." Taylor smiled. "With people like you on the inside and people like me on the outside, maybe it finally will be." As the crowd dispersed, Anthony looked back at the courthouse where he had practiced law for years. For the first time, he saw it not just as a place where he worked, but as a battleground where justice was either upheld or denied every day. The system had almost crushed him, despite all his advantages. How many others hadn't been so fortunate? How many had been silenced, had pleaded guilty to crimes they didn't commit? had lost faith in the very idea of justice. Anthony turned to Thomas and Lisa. "We've got work to do," he said. And they did. 6 months had passed since that day in Judge Simmons' courtroom. Anthony sat at his desk in the U.S. Attorney's office, reviewing the preliminary findings of the investigation he had launched. The thick report contained statistics, testimonies, and documented patterns that painted a troubling picture of the local justice system. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. His colleague, Patricia Chen, leaned in. "The press conference is set for 2 o'clock, she said. "Are you ready?" Anthony nodded, closing the folder. "As ready as I'll ever be." After his case had been dismissed, Anthony had faced a choice: return to his regular caseload or use his position and experience to push for broader change. With the support of his supervisors at the Department of Justice, he had chosen the latter, heading a special task force investigating patterns of bias in local law enforcement and courts. The past 6 months had been intense. His team had interviewed hundreds of people, former defendants, community members, police officers willing to speak off the record, court staff, and defense attorneys. They had analyzed thousands of case files and court transcripts, looking for statistical patterns that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. What they found had confirmed his worst suspicions. Judge Simmons was far from the only problem. The entire system showed clear patterns of racial disparity in traffic stops, searches, arrests, charging decisions, bail amounts, and sentencing. Now, it was time to make those findings public. As Anthony gathered his notes for the press conference, his phone rang. It was Thomas. "Have you seen the news?" his friend asked without preamble. "Which news?" "Reyes just testified before the grand jury. It's all over the local stations." Anthony smiled slightly. True to his word, Officer Reyes had come forward with documentation of misconduct within the police department. His testimony had led to a separate grand jury investigation, focusing specifically on Officer Wilson and several other officers with histories of complaints. "How did he look?" Anthony asked. "Nervous but determined," Thomas replied. "He's doing the right thing even though it's costing him. Word is half the department won't speak to him now." "Make sure he has support," Anthony said. "We need more officers like him willing to break the blue wall of silence." After hanging up, Anthony checked the time. The press conference was in an hour, and he still needed to review his remarks one last time. His assistant, David, appeared at the door. "Your wife is online too." Anthony picked up the phone. "Hey, Lisa. Just wanted to wish you good luck," she said. "Zoe and I will be watching from home. Thanks." "I'm a little nervous, to be honest." Lisa laughed gently. "You faced down Judge Simmons in his own courtroom. You can handle a few reporters." "This is different," Anthony said. "What we're releasing today, it's going to cause an uproar. A lot of powerful people are going to be very unhappy." "Good," Lisa replied firmly. "They should be unhappy. They've been getting away with injustice for far too long." After they hung up, Anthony gathered his materials and headed to the conference room where the press event would be held. The hallway was already crowded with reporters and camera crews. He spotted Richard Taylor, the community organizer he'd met outside the courthouse, standing with a group of activists who had been instrumental in collecting testimonies from affected community members. Inside the conference room, Anthony took his place at the table alongside Patricia and the U.S. Attorney himself, Benjamin Harris, who had fully supported the investigation from the beginning. The room quickly filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls. At precisely 2 o'clock, Harris approached the podium. "Good afternoon. Today, the United States Department of Justice is releasing its preliminary findings, following a 6-month investigation into patterns and practices within the local justice system. This investigation was initiated following a case that many of you reported on, the wrongful arrest and prosecution of one of our own assistant U.S. attorneys, Anthony Reynolds." Harris gestured toward Anthony, who nodded acknowledgement as cameras flashed. "What began as a single incident has revealed systemic issues that demand immediate attention. I'll now turn the podium over to Assistant U.S. Attorney Reynolds, who has led this investigation." Anthony rose and approached the podium, placing his notes carefully before him. He looked out at the sea of faces, reporters, community members, and colleagues. 6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom not far from here and experienced firsthand how justice can be denied based on the color of one's skin. What happened to me that night and in that courtroom was not unusual. The only unusual aspect was that I was in a position to fight back effectively, He gestured to the reports being distributed by staff members. These findings tell the story of a justice system that operates differently depending on who you are. The data shows that black and brown drivers in our county are 5 times more likely to be pulled over than white drivers. They are 8 times more likely to be searched during those stops, despite contraband being found less frequently than in searches of white drivers. Anthony continued methodically through the findings, keeping his tone measured despite the damning statistics. In cases involving testimony from police officers, Judge Harold Simmons ruled in favor of officer testimony over civilian testimony in 97% of cases involving black defendants, compared to 74% of cases involving white defendants. When these rulings were appealed, they were overturned at a rate 3 times higher than the national average. He paused, letting the information sink in. These aren't just numbers. Each statistic represents real people whose lives were impacted, whose trust in our justice system was damaged, and whose rights were violated. The room was completely silent as Anthony outlined the recommendations that would accompany the report. Independent oversight of the police department, mandatory body cameras, revised training protocols, and regular audits of judicial decisions for patterns of bias. Finally, Anthony said, "We are announcing that a formal civil rights investigation has been opened into the practices of both the police department and the county court system. This investigation may result in a consent decree requiring specific reforms with federal oversight." As questions began, Anthony noticed a figure slip into the back of the room. Judge Simmons himself, looking far older than he had 6 months earlier. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space. The judge gave a small, tight nod before turning to leave. After the press conference, as the room gradually emptied, Richard Taylor approached Anthony. "This is just the beginning," he said, holding up the report. "Now comes the hard part, making sure these recommendations actually become reality." Anthony nodded. "We're in this for the long haul. Change doesn't happen overnight." "No, but sometimes it takes one case, one moment to start the ball rolling," Taylor replied. "Your case was that moment for us." Later that evening, Anthony sat on his back porch with Lisa, watching the news coverage of the press conference. "They're already pushing back," Lisa noted, pointing to a statement from the police union claiming the report was biased and politically motivated. "Of course they are," Anthony replied. "No one gives up power willingly." His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Thomas. "Officer Wilson indicted by grand jury on multiple counts of civil rights violations. Rhea's testimony was key." Anthony showed the message to Lisa, who smiled. "One small victory." "They add up," Anthony said, putting an arm around her shoulders. His phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. It was from a name he didn't recognize, with the subject line, "Your story gave me courage." He opened it to find a message from a young black law student who had been wrongfully arrested the previous year and had taken a plea deal despite being innocent, afraid of what might happen if he fought the charges. "After seeing what you did," the email read, "I've decided to speak out about what happened to me. If someone in your position can face this kind of injustice but still find a way to fight back and create change, then I can find that courage too. Thank you for showing me that the system can be challenged." Anthony read the message twice, then showed it to Lisa. "This," he said quietly, "this is why it all matters." 1 year to the day after Anthony's arrest, he stood on the steps of the courthouse again, but under very different circumstances. Behind him gathered a diverse group, community leaders, reform-minded police officers including Rhea's defense attorneys, and everyday citizens who had experienced injustice firsthand. The city had just signed a consent decree with the Department of Justice, agreeing to sweeping reforms in both the police department and courts. Judge Simmons had announced his retirement. Officer Wilson was awaiting trial on multiple charges, and a civilian oversight board had been established with real power to investigate complaints against police. As cameras rolled, Anthony stepped to the microphone. 1 year ago, I was wrongfully arrested on these very steps. Today, we announce the beginning of real change in our justice system. This consent decree isn't the end of our work, it's just the beginning. True justice requires constant vigilance and commitment from all of us. He looked out at the gathered crowd, at the faces of people who had shared their stories, who had been brave enough to speak truth to power. What happened to me was not unique. What's unique is the response. A community coming together to demand better. A justice department willing to hold local authorities accountable, and brave individuals within the system willing to stand up for what's right. A young reporter raised her hand. Do you think what happened to you was ultimately a good thing, given the changes it's led to? Anthony considered the question carefully. I would never call injustice a good thing, but I believe in making meaning from hardship. What happened to me opened a door that had been firmly closed. It created an opportunity for voices that had long been silenced to finally be heard. He gestured to the diverse group behind him. These are the real heroes of this story. The people who have been fighting for justice long before my case made headlines, and who will continue that fight long after today's news cycle ends. As the press conference concluded, Anthony found himself standing next to Reyes, who was now working with the department's newly formed integrity unit. Was it worth it? Anthony asked him quietly. Reyes watched as community members and officers talked together on the courthouse steps, not as adversaries, but as partners in creating a more just system. It was, he said simply. For the first time since I joined the force, I'm proud of the badge I wear. Anthony nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The system wasn't fixed, far from it. The consent decree was just paper until its provisions were actually implemented. Bias wouldn't disappear overnight. Trust would take years to rebuild, but something had changed. A door had been opened that could not easily be closed again. And through that door, a more just future was finally visible, not as a distant dream but as a possibility within reach.